Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel, my friend. Allow yourself to settle into a calm and comfortable space as we begin a gentle journey through the pages of history. Tonight, we will open a quiet book filled with stories woven by past centuries, and we will read it slowly, softly, in a low voice that simply keeps you company and guides you toward relaxation and perhaps toward sleep. Our topic tonight is about a family whose name you may have heard before, a family that became linked with money, power, and many legends that surrounded it through the ages. It is the Rothschild family, a family said to have gathered a fortune beyond comparison, perhaps the richest family in all of human history. Yet behind the numbers and the myths lies a wondrous story spread over generations, rich with tiny details about life in the European cities of the 18th and 19th centuries. It is a story about trade and banks and great transformations that helped shape the modern world we live in today. And we will not chase excitement, but instead rest in a calm contemplation of how this family came to be. We will ask how its members carved their path through the narrow alleys of Frankfurt, and how they later spread toward the great capitals of London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. We will listen to small details about the houses they lived in, the crowded streets they walked, the financial papers that bore their signatures, until a patient, quiet picture of their lives begins to form. On this journey, we will not hurry our steps. We will pause sometimes to observe a scene, perhaps a stone alleyway in Frankfurt, or a grand reception hall in one of the palaces of Vienna. We will move gently between past and present, like someone watching the reflection of the moon on still water, and you can allow your mind to loosen and relax. There is no need to remember every detail. It is enough just to listen and let the story flow through you in peace. Perhaps it will slowly melt into a soft drowsiness. And now we can begin the first chapter of the tale, the modest beginnings in Frankfurt. When we go back in time to the middle of the 18th century, we find ourselves in the city of Frankfurt, a German city then surrounded by stone walls guarded by great gates that were closed at night. The air there was filled with the smell of burning wood from small stoves, sometimes mixed with the scent of fresh bread coming from the ovens of the neighborhood. In the heart of that city there was an old quarter known as the Jewish Quarter. In German it was called the Ghetto of Frankfurt. It was not a wide or luxurious district, but a crowded place of narrow alleys where rickety wooden houses leaned so close together that they almost shaded the street from both sides. Tiny windows looked out onto uneven stone roads, and people rarely stopped moving, especially near the markets, where simple goods were displayed. There were fabrics, spices, metal tools, and religious books written in Hebrew, and it is here, in this modest place, that the story of the Rothschild family began. The family was not yet known for its wealth. It lived like the rest of the residents of the quarter in a small, simple dwelling. On the door of the house there was a modest sign, a board bearing the picture of a red shield. And at the time that shield did not carry much meaning. Yet later it would become the symbol of the entire family and the name by which they would be known across Europe. From it came the name Rothschild, which in German means the red shield, and the founder of this line was a man named Meyer Amschel Rothschild. He was born in the year 1744, not into a rich family, but he possessed a quiet intelligence and a far-sighted way of looking at things. His father worked in trading old coins, the kinds collected by nobles and lovers of history. At the same time, he served as a religious guide in the local Jewish community, and so Meyer grew up among these books and coins, between the stories of the Torah and the tales of the marketplace. His childhood was not easy. The quarter was overcrowded and opportunities were limited. and the Jewish population lived under strict laws imposed by the local authorities. They were not allowed to practice all professions, nor were they allowed to live outside the small area assigned to them. Yet, in the middle of these restrictions, a kind of inner solidarity grew, where families supported one another and held on to learning and tradition. Meyer showed an early interest in trade. He used to sit beside his father, watching the different coins and touching them with his small fingers. He would notice the delicate engravings on them and listen to the stories of the kings and principalities that had issued each one. And with time he learned that every coin carried a political and economic tale. He understood that money was not just polished metal, but a reflection of power, decisions, and history. When his father died, Meyer was still a young man, yet he inherited from him a small office for trading old coins. It was not a grand office, just a narrow room filled with wooden boxes and old ledgers. But this small place was the seed of a much larger dream. In that room, Meyer began dealing with customers from outside the quarter. Among them big merchants and sometimes local officials seeking rare coins or short-term loans. In Frankfurt, a successful merchant was someone who combined precise accounting with the ability to gain trust, and Meyer had both qualities. He was calm in his manner, careful to record everything accurately in his books, and avoided open quarrels. Little by little his name became familiar among a group of wealthy traders who began to rely on him for exchanging money and precious metals. Yet Meyer was not a traditional merchant. He had the ability to read great transformations through small details. At that time, Europe was undergoing big changes. Wars kept breaking out, kingdoms constantly needed financing, and the economy was becoming ever more dependent on loans and money transfers. Meyer realized that money could move faster than armies, and that whoever controlled the movement of money would possess an influence greater than swords and cannons. Thus, this modest Jewish youth from a narrow quarter in Frankfurt started drawing the first lines of a financial empire. And it was not quick or easy. It was like a small river sliding between rocks, widening slowly until it becomes a great stream. And as we follow Meyer Amschel Rothschild after he inherited his father's office, we see that he did not content himself with repeating what already existed. He may have begun with the trade of old coins, but he soon widened his view beyond buying and selling rare pieces. He saw in every transaction an opportunity, and in every commercial relationship a door that could lead him into a new world. In that period, princes and nobles had a particular passion for collecting historical coins. It was a hobby that displayed refined taste and signaled social status. Among those nobles was Prince Wilhelm IX, the ruler of Hesse-Kassel, who became one of Meyer's most important clients. The relationship between a young merchant and a powerful prince was not an equal one, but it was based on trust and patience. Meyer, with care and precision, learned how to satisfy the prince's desire for rare coins and how to use this relationship to build a network of influence. Here the first clear signs of great ambition appeared. Meyer no longer viewed coins as just profitable merchandise. He saw them as a way to come closer to a higher class that he was not allowed to join directly, and with time he understood that princes were not only collectors of coins, but were also in constant need of money to run their realms, especially during war. Germany in the 18th century was like a mosaic of small states and principalities. Each prince had his own court, and each city had its own rules. But the thing they all shared was a constant need for funds. There were small armies that needed wages, fortifications that needed building, and palaces that required continuous spending, while their treasuries were not always full. This is where the role of financiers appeared, and Meyer Amschel understood that reality early. Instead of limiting himself to coin trading, he began to enter the field of lending, and it was not an easy step. for Jews at the time faced strict restrictions in financial dealings, yet the urgent need of princes for money opened small gaps that could be used. And step by step, his name became known not only among collectors of coins, but also among elites looking for fast and reliable financing. We can imagine his small office in Frankfurt slowly changing, no longer just a room stacked with boxes of metal coins. It turned into a place where delicate deals were managed. On a simple wooden table lay account sheets, ledgers full of numbers, and letters written in elegant handwriting bearing official seals. Clients would come in unassuming visits, ask for financial services, then return to their palaces, while Maya sat quietly, recording everything with extreme care, as if he were drawing a map for a long journey that had barely begun. Although his work was expanding, his daily life in the Jewish quarter remained modest. He did not move to a palace, nor to a wide house outside the ghetto. He continued living in the same dwelling behind the red shield, surrounded by his neighbors. And this balance between an outward simplicity and growing inner influence became a hallmark of the family for many years. In this period, Maya was no longer alone. He married Guttel Schnapper, a strong-willed woman who helped him manage both home and family. They had several children who would later carry the Rothschilds' name to every corner of Europe. But in those early years, they were just children playing in the alleys, unaware that their names would one day be written in history books. One of the most remarkable things about Maya's way of working at that time was that he did not rush. He knew that real wealth did not come from a single deal, but from building long-term trust. So he focused on patience and on repeating small transactions that created strong friendships. And slowly he became one of the familiar faces in the world of local finance. Yet the horizon before him was much wider than Frankfurt alone. For Europe in the late 18th century was moving toward deep transformations. The French Revolution was approaching, wars were on the verge of erupting, and economic changes were pushing states to search for new ways to finance their armies and projects. All this meant that the need for financiers like Maya would grow more and more, and the scene became clear. The young coin dealer was no longer just a local name in the Jewish quarter. He had become a bridge between the world of simple people in Frankfurt and the world of nobles in their palaces. At the same time, he was planting seeds that would carry his family to a position no one could have imagined. And in the small house behind the door, marked with the red shield in the Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, Maya Amschel Rothschild did not intend to work alone forever. With time, his sons grew up, one after another, under the watchful eyes of their strict mother Guttel, who ran the home with much firmness and care. The 5 sons, Amschel, Salomon, Nathan, Carl, and James, were at first only boys running through the narrow alleys, playing with sticks and stones, listening from afar to the noise of the nearby market and the calls of traders. Yet the atmosphere inside the house was different. Within those walls, their father's voice rose as he explained to them about money, about ledgers, and about the importance of precision in everything. From an early age, they realized that their lives would not be ordinary. Their father taught them patience, just as he taught them arithmetic, repeating that money was not a goal in itself, but a way to understand the world and to influence it. Their family gatherings tended toward seriousness. There was no loud talk and little joking, but there were stories about a rare Oman coin, or about a client seeking a loan, or about changes in the trade of a distant city. Their mother Guttel was also a central figure. In that traditional society, the woman had an essential role in caring for the home and ensuring discipline. She did not only look after the children, but also managed fine details in her husband's work, organizing correspondence, following small accounts, and reminding him of family obligations. and it is said that she was so firm that her sons continued to speak of her strength even after they became men who owned banks and palaces. With time, Maya began testing his sons with simple tasks, sending one to deliver a letter to a local merchant or assigning another to follow up on a small deal. Step by step, these tasks turned into practical training until each of them came to acquire the language of money and accounting as if it were his native tongue. The Jewish quarter in Frankfurt, despite its restrictions, became a surprising school for learning. The narrow alleys taught the sons to pay attention to tiny details, to the faces of people, to the tones of their voices, even to the language of their bodies. A successful merchant was not only someone who knew his numbers, but someone who could silently read others. And when the sons grew a little older, their father began sending them beyond the quarter to the larger markets where traders from many backgrounds mingled. There they saw a world much wider than the stone alleys they had grown up in. They heard different tongues, German, French, Italian, and began to understand that money was a universal language that could link distant palaces with modest houses. Maya planted in them a clear idea that success does not come from passing enthusiasm, but from a connected network of trust and hard work. He did not ask them to dream of palaces or influence. He asked them to master the art of discipline, careful accounting, and keeping their word. Behind all this, a vision took shape in his mind, that his 5 sons would one day be armed, stretching out beyond Frankfurt to the major capitals of Europe. Yet, in that moment, the idea remained only a long-term plan told to them quietly between conversations on calm evenings. When the noise of the quarter faded at night, the family would gather in a small room lit by oil lamps. The father opened his ledgers, the sons sat around him, and the mother watched with an alert eye. The scene seemed simple, but in truth it was the beginning of forming a whole generation that would later change the financial face of Europe. And what distinguished this upbringing was that it mixed firmness with affection. The sons were not pampered yet, not abandoned. Each one learned from childhood to carry part of the burden and to appreciate the value of effort. This is what made them later able to embark on large commercial adventures in foreign lands, far from their first home. Thus, the story of the Rothschild family was not just the tale of one man, but the story of an entire household, the founding father, the strict mother, and the 5 sons who would soon become the pillars of a financial empire. The seeds were being planted quietly, and what looked like a simple life inside the Jewish quarter was in fact a preparation for a journey that would go far. Beyond the borders of Frankfurt, among the narrow alleys of Frankfurt, amid the echoes of markets and the glow of home fires, the Rothschild family took its first steps toward a world far wider than their neighbors could imagine. The city itself was a turning point. It was not the largest or richest in Germany, but it had a special place as a trading center, a meeting point for caravans, and an important station between the north and south of Europe. This geographical position meant that Frankfurt was not just a local town, but a small gateway connecting major trade routes. And for Meyer Amschel Rothschild, this environment was ideal for building his network. The bustling markets attracted traders from distant lands, and imperial celebrations, such as the coronation of Holy Roman Emperors, brought nobles and princes from all corners of the continent. Every visit and every meeting was a small opportunity that might bear fruit later. Yet behind this lively image there were still heavy restrictions on the Jews. They were not allowed to own land outside the quarter, nor to practice most professions. They lived in narrow streets whose gates were closed at night, as if they were on an island inside their own city. Despite that, some of them managed to find inventive ways to exert influence, and money was the tool they used, a fact Maya understood early. In this phase, his relationship with Prince Wilhelm IX grew deeper. It no longer stopped at supplying him with rare coins. It expanded into managing his funds and investments, and with each new step, Maya won more of the prince's confidence. For the prince, it was a practical matter, a precise and trustworthy man who helped organize his wealth, while for Maya it was a window into the world of the court, a world he could not enter directly yet could deal with from a hidden position of strength. We can imagine Maya's office in those years, wooden shelves full of ledgers, small sacks of metal coins neatly arranged, and on the desk a quill and dark ink, with a metal box for important documents. The office was not luxurious, but it reflected a strict order. Everything was recorded, every financial movement documented. Even the smallest transactions were not left to memory alone. In the evening, when the gates of the quarter were closed, Maya returned to his small home, where under the light of lamps his sons listened to his stories about the day. These were not tales of spectacular adventures or loud events. They were stories of deals, of the trust of a new client, of the importance of patience. And through these simple conversations the sons learned that money did not move with the speed of the wind, but, like water carving its way slowly through rock. As time passed, the idea of sending the sons outside Frankfurt grew clearer. Europe was changing. The Napoleonic Wars loomed. Financial markets were gaining importance, and trade was no longer limited to small towns. It was clear that the family could not remain confined within the Jewish quarter forever. They needed to cross toward the wider world. Yet at the end of the 18th century, this remained long-term planning. The roots were still in Frankfurt, and the house with the red shield was still the center. Every deal and every new relationship was a brick in a building that had not yet been completed. And perhaps what is most striking about this early phase is that everything happened quietly. There were no sudden leaps or dramatic turns. Everything formed slowly like a painting drawn in fine strokes over many years. And Maya and his family were not yet the legendary clan that would fill the pages of books. They were simply a small family living under restrictions but holding a vision that reached beyond the walls of their quarter. And when the 5 sons grew older, it became clear that Frankfurt was no longer big enough for Maya Amschel Rothschild's dreams. The little house with the red shield remained the symbolic center of the family. But the path to wider influence led through the great capitals of Europe. Maya believed his sons would not achieve their full success if they all stayed in the Jewish quarter. For the true horizon lay beyond the walls, in the cities that controlled politics and money. The first great step came through Nathan Meyer Rothschild, the 3rd son, who was sent to England. London, at the beginning of the 19th century, was a vast, noisy city brimming with maritime trade and growing financial markets, its harbour crowded with ships arriving from colonies around the world. Its streets were full of merchants and bankers, and the entire city lived a level of prosperity rarely seen in Europe before. And when Nathan arrived there, he was not a rich man or a figure of status. He was simply a young man at the beginning of his journey, carrying a name that did not yet have weight in London. Yet he brought with him something more important, a mind trained in precision, a network of trust built by his father in Frankfurt, and above all, a tireless ambition. Nathan started his work by selling German textiles, and it was not a glamorous business, but it gave him an entry into the British market. In small shops near the harbour, he spread his fabrics, dealt with local traders, and built a reputation based on punctuality and quality goods. He did not raise his voice nor boast about wealth. He let his actions build a steady name for him, and he soon realized that the real money in London was not in cloth alone. London was the capital of money par excellence. where the prices of commodities were set and the loans that financed wars and overseas trade were arranged. At this moment, Nathan's intelligence appeared clearly. He gradually left the textile trade and entered the world of finance, lending merchants, participating in import and export deals, and investing in British government bonds. His presence in London coincided with one of the most turbulent periods in European history, the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain needed constant money to fund its armies while France, under Napoleon, continued its expansion. In this context, financing became a decisive factor. Money was no longer just a means of living but the fuel of war and politics, and Nathan Rothschild showed his special ability. He began working with the British government to move funds and support military campaigns, and one of his major tasks was financing the armies of the Duke of Wellington in his battles against Napoleon. This mission was not simple. The money had to cross disturbed borders and arrive safely and quickly. Nathan built a wide network of correspondents and agents, using the fast lines of communication that the family had created among its branches, and thanks to this network he achieved what many local bankers could not. The operation was not just a financial deal, it was proof that the Rothschild family could control the flow of money as if it controlled the veins of Europe. While others saw war only as danger, Nathan saw it as a test of trust and organizational ability. And over the years, his offices in London turned into a large financial center. He was no longer the young man selling fabrics. He had become a name known in British banking circles. His clients were not just local traders but the government itself, ministers and senior officers, and we can imagine his office in London filled with maps, letters arriving from Frankfurt, Paris, and Vienna, and precise numbers reflecting the movement of money across the continent. On his desk, news gathered before it reached the newspapers, for money traveled faster than words. And for his brothers in Frankfurt, Nathan was the hand that reached out to the strongest financial capital in the world. With each success he achieved, he opened doors for the rest of the family to spread into other capitals. And thus, step by step, the Rothschilds emerged from the alleys of Frankfurt into the heart of London, the city that never slept and that represented the beating heart of European money. Nathan's success was not a personal victory alone. It was the practical proof of an idea that Rothschild could become a European family, not just a German one, and so the threads of the financial empire began to form slowly. One thread in London, and soon other threads would follow in Paris, Vienna, and Naples, and while Nathan moved confidently in London, his brother Salomon Rothschild was carving a different path in the middle of Central Europe. His destination was Vienna, the flourishing capital of the Austrian Empire, a city of grand palaces, classical music, and heavy bureaucracy that controlled one of the most complex empires in Europe. Vienna was not like other cities. It was the seat of the imperial court of the Habsburgs, where political and military decisions were made that affected almost half of Europe. Its streets glowed with gas lamps at night, and were lined with cafes where thinkers and artists met, while in palace halls broad meetings shaped the fate of wars and alliances. Into this awe-inspiring world came Salomon Rothschild, carrying the family name and his father's vision, and the path was not easy. Austria was a conservative empire, hesitant to trust newcomers, especially those of Jewish background, yet Salomon had a quiet but powerful weapon. He had the experience of his brother Nathan in London and the backing of a family network that was expanding every day, and at first he focused on financial services linked to the Austrian government. The empire constantly needed money to finance its armies, especially with the continuous threat posed by Napoleon and his wars sweeping across Europe, and Salomon saw his opportunity. He offered loans and organized state debts. using the British government's trust in his brother Nathan as proof of the family's competence. In the beginning, his work focused on arranging loans and managing debts, but with every carefully executed deal, his relationship with the Viennese authorities grew deeper. Each new agreement increased the standing of the Rothschild name at the imperial court, and soon Salomon was regarded as one of the most important bankers in the empire. His success was not only financial, for Vienna was a city of culture and art, and he also needed to harmonize with its social rhythm. He began to support infrastructure projects and to participate in elite circles where politicians and men of money met, and his presence in splendid salons where the music of Beethoven and Schubert was played became a sign of the family's gradual integration into a society that did not easily welcome outsiders. We can imagine his office in Vienna taking on a more formal character than his father's old room in Frankfurt, with polished wooden floors, tall windows looking onto a main street, and a broad desk scattered with maps and documents. His visitors were no longer only merchants, but ministers and official envoys seeking huge loans that could determine the course of war or internal stability. And in this period, the family's strategy began to show its full strength. Each brother chose a city as his base, immersed himself in its economy, and built the trust of its government. But what gave the plan its real power was the connection between them. Salomon in Vienna did not work separately from Nathan in London, or from the brothers who would later spread to Paris and Naples. And letters traveled constantly between them, carrying news of markets, commodity prices, and political developments. This network kept them always ahead of their competitors in knowing events and making decisions, and Salomon, with his quiet nature, differed from Nathan, who was known for his boldness in London. He was more cautious and more suited to the slow rhythm of the imperial court. Yet in this way he proved that he was the right man in the right place, weaving a long-term relationship with the Habsburg Empire that would last for decades and give the family a firm footing in the heart of Europe. In the evenings he would sit writing long letters to his brothers, describing in detail his meetings with officials, sending his observations about the Austrian economy, and warning of political changes beginning to appear on the horizon. These letters were like threads, tying the family members across the continent, making them work as if they were one office, despite the distances. And thus, the Rothschild of Vienna became more than a trader or banker. He became part of the fabric connecting money and politics in the Austrian Empire. And with every new step, he opened the door for his brothers to continue the expansion, each one in his own city, until the family's network came close to covering the whole of Europe. After Nathan had firmly established himself in London and Salomon in Vienna, it was the turn of the youngest brother, James Rothschild, whose destination was Paris, a city that was not only a capital but the symbol of an entire age. In the early 19th century, Paris was the city of Napoleon and then the city of kings who returned after his fall. A place of broad boulevards, ornate palaces, and lively cafes filled with political and intellectual debates. When James arrived in Paris, he was a young man full of ambition, bringing the same family legacy of patience, precision, and discipline, but he also possessed a light, graceful presence that helped him adapt to the refined social atmosphere of the French capital. Unlike his cautious brother in Vienna or his practical brother in London, James knew how to blend into Parisian society, which mixed money with art, the royal court with literary salons. At first, he focused on supporting the trade of textiles and wines, benefiting from the ties France had with England and Germany. But soon, like his brothers, he turned to the more important field, finance. France at that time was passing through major political changes, the French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, and then the restoration of the monarchy. And all of this left the economy unstable and the government in constant need of loans to steady its rule. Here James found his golden chance, for thanks to the family network he could offer what many competitors could not: speed and reliability in transferring money across Europe. The family as a whole worked as one integrated system, able to move funds more quickly between London and Paris or Vienna and Frankfurt than the traditional banking system allowed. And this advantage led the French government and many businessmen to rely increasingly on James. His influence was not purely financial, for Paris was the true city of politics, and anyone who wished to succeed there had to know how to draw close to the royal court. James mastered this art with skill, beginning by attending official events and supporting public projects, and with time his name became well known in the circles of power. His presence at royal gatherings was not just that of a guest, but that of a financial partner who could be trusted in difficult times. And we can imagine his Paris office decorated in a different style from his brother's rooms. Fine furniture reflecting French taste, walls adorned with small paintings, and an elegant desk filled with letters arriving from London, Vienna, and Frankfurt. Yet beneath this beauty, the atmosphere remained the same. Quiet focus, precise calculations, and never-ending correspondence between the brothers. Paris was not only the city of money and politics, but also the city of culture, and James's presence there gave the family a window into the world of art and fashionable society. While his brothers concentrated on funding wars and large projects, James added a social and cultural touch to the family network, strengthening their reputation in the eyes of Europeans. Over the years, he became one of France's most important bankers, no longer the young newcomer but a pillar of the French financial system and one of the prominent figures who balanced money, politics, and culture. It is striking that each brother seemed to reflect a personality suited to his city. Nathan in London was strict and practical in the heart of the capital of money. Salomon in Vienna was cautious and disciplined in the presence of the imperial court. And James in Paris was sociable and flexible in a city that combined authority and art. This diversity was not an accident. It was the secret of the family's strength, for each brother formed a piece of a larger picture, in which the parts completed one another to create an interconnected European network. In the evenings, James also wrote his long letters, telling his brothers about changes in the Parisian markets and rapidly shifting political moods. And in return he received their news from London and Vienna. In this way the full picture remained clear before the entire family. And with James in Paris, another thread was added to the family network, one that tied money to culture and politics to the economy. The Rothschilds were no longer a local German family. They had become an emerging European power, and while London, Paris, and Vienna throbbed with politics and money, the city of Naples in the far south of Italy shone with the light of the Mediterranean Sea. It was a city of narrow, cobbled streets and colourful facades overlooking the harbours, with daily life full of music, food, and the scent of the sea. To Naples the family sent Karl Rothschild, one of the 5 brothers, to complete their circle of influence, and the choice of Naples was not random. Despite its distance from major political centres, such as Vienna and Paris, it was a strategic site. The Kingdom of Naples held political weight and often needed loans to manage its internal affairs and finance its alliances. Having a Rothschild branch there meant watching the south of Europe closely and controlling an important part of the flow of money linking Italian kingdoms with the rest of the continent, and Karl, carrying his father Mayor's careful spirit, began his work in Naples the same way his brothers had in other capitals. He established a small office, dealt with local merchants, and gradually approached the ruling circles. And soon he proved his competence in arranging loans and organizing transfers between Naples and London or Paris. Over time his name became familiar at the Neapolitan court, yet Naples was not only a city of business. It was also a bustling port where the voices of vendors mingled with the smell of fresh bread and seafood. In this environment, Karl's office looked like an island of order and calm in the middle of charming Italian chaos, and his desk received officials, major merchants, and envoys from other governments, all trusting the Rothschild's ability to provide liquidity with speed and accuracy. Karl's presence in Naples was not only important financially but also politically, for through his network of contacts he became a link between southern Europe and the other capitals controlled by his brothers. If the Neapolitan court needed a sudden loan, Karl would coordinate with Nathan in London or James in Paris. And if there was a need to move funds or buy bonds, he turned to the wider family network. And in this way, Naples became part of a sleepless financial system. It moved through quiet threads, connecting every corner of the continent. And at the same time, Karl had his own social and emotional life in Naples, different from the strictness of London and the formality of Vienna. The city's warmth and openness gave his days a softer rhythm, and we can imagine him on summer evenings sitting on the balcony of his house overlooking the sea, watching the moon's reflection on the waves, while the sound of popular music rose from nearby streets. This atmosphere made his presence in Neapolitan society more accepted and gave him a special position different from his brothers. And it is interesting to see how each brother matched the nature of his city. Nathan moved with the speed of London, Salomon with the traditions of Vienna, James with the elegance of Paris, and Karl with the warmth of Naples. So each became part of the fabric of his city, and at the same time a thread in a larger family web. With this network fully spread from Frankfurt to London and from Paris to Vienna and Naples, it became clear that the Rothschilds were no longer a local banking family. They had become a complete European network capable of moving vast sums of capital, influencing government decisions, and connecting markets in ways the world had not seen before. And in the evening, when everything quieted down, Karl, like his brothers, would write long letters. He told them about the Neapolitan court, the local markets, and the merchants who had placed their trust in him. And when these letters joined the messages of Nathan, Salomon, and James, they formed a complete picture of the continent. It was a picture read calmly in offices lit by oil lamps and later translated into major financial and political decisions. And with that, the first phase of the family's expansion ended. 5 brothers in 5 great cities were weaving an unprecedented financial network, quiet on the surface, but with deep influence, one that would become the foundation of a wealth and power for which history knew few parallels. By the first half of the 19th century, the brothers' network was complete. London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt itself were all hubs in a financial system managed by a single family. This was the moment when the Rothschild name began to move beyond the boundaries of banking to become almost synonymous with influence itself. And at that time, the world was changing quickly. The Industrial Revolution was leaving its marks on factories and ports. The first railways were slowly splitting the earth, carrying coal, iron, and people between cities. And European governments were racing to build modern armies and to fund huge projects that required enormous loans. Here, the family emerged as a partner no one could do without. And one of the clearest examples of their power was their role in financing wars. After Napoleon's defeat, Europe entered a period of comprehensive reordering. Kingdoms and empires weighed down with debt looked for someone to help them rebuild their financial balance. And thanks to their network, the Rothschilds were able to grant loans, restructure debts, and provide liquidity with a speed impossible through traditional channels. They did not stop at wars. They also funded major infrastructure projects, and when railways began to spread across Europe, the family was among the first to invest in this new field. It was not only because trains were profitable, but because they were a way to strengthen the connections between the markets they controlled for a railway linking Paris and Frankfurt or Vienna and Budapest was not just a means of transport. It was another thread in the financial net they had woven. And in London, Nathan had become a figure that could not be ignored, working with government loans, public projects, and daily dealings with top businessmen and politicians. In Paris, James maintained his position as banker to the court, balancing between money and politics, and in Vienna, Salomon continued to deepen the relationship with the Habsburgs, while in Naples, Karl ensured that southern Europe stayed within the family's orbit. What draws attention is how the family dealt with news and information. At a time when there was no telephone, they relied on a network of couriers and private letters carried on horseback, and in some cases even by carrier pigeons. This speed in receiving information gave them a clear edge, and it was said that Nathan in London knew the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo before the British government itself, thanks to messages arriving from the continent. This advantage in knowledge turned directly into smart financial decisions, large profits, and further influence. Yet amid all this power, the family kept its cautious and balanced style. They did not chase the spotlight. Their palaces were magnificent, but not excessively ostentatious. And their social lives were active, but they knew how to stay in the shadows when needed. As if they understood that their real strength lay not in displaying wealth, but in quietly guiding the wheels of the economy from behind the scenes. In this period, legends began to surround them, tales of how they controlled gold prices, influenced wars, or even determined the policies of kings. Some of these stories were exaggerated and perhaps born from imaginations that could not understand how one family could possess such influence, but part of them reflected a clear truth, that the Rothschilds had become key players no major government could ignore. We can picture Europe in that era as a great board where roads, railways, trade routes, and political ties intersected. And at the center of this board there were invisible threads. They represented letters and financial instructions moving between London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples, quiet yet powerful lines held by the family tying together the different parts of the continent, and this was the peak of their power. It was the moment when the name Rothschild was no longer merely a family name but almost an institution, a financial continent standing on its own, and yet, despite all this influence, they clung to one constant rule. The family had to remain united, and its secrets had to stay protected within the walls of their palaces and offices. And by the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds were no longer simply successful bankers. They had become a silent political force, stretching its threads across all of Europe, and in London, Paris, and Vienna governments relied on them for enormous loans, not only during war, but also in peacetime to finance railways, infrastructure, and old debts. The money they managed was like a bloodstream feeding an entire continent, and Europe at that time was like a vast chessboard. Kings and empires allied today and clashed tomorrow, while in the background a delicate network of financial relations kept the balance between them. The Rothschilds knew that wealth alone was not enough, and that maintaining influence required mutual trust with every side. So they were careful to act as bankers to all without showing obvious bias. In Vienna, their close relationship with the Habsburg Empire had reached its peak. Salomon served almost as an unofficial financial advisor to the emperor himself, relied upon for major loans and debt restructuring, and the imperial court saw the Rothschilds as trustworthy partners, able to fill the treasury at the right time. In France, things were more delicate. Paris, under King Louis-Philippe, experienced economic growth, but also political tension, and in that climate, James managed his balance with great care. He was close to the court, yet also kept good relations with industrialists and members of the bourgeoisie who supported reforms, and thus James became a link between the world of politics and the world of money, knowing how to open doors without knocking too loudly. In London, Nathan's influence extended even into Parliament, and though he was not a politician in the usual sense, he was a hidden maker of financial decisions. When the government needed funding for its wars against Napoleon, or when it planned to expand its projects in the colonies, the Rothschild office was the first destination, and some ministers were said to avoid taking any major economic decision without consulting Nathan or his successors in the family. While these relationships gave the family enormous power, they relied on secrecy and neutrality as tools for survival. For the Rothschilds understood that the world was changing quickly and that openly taking sides could be fatal. They therefore spread their investments among competing countries, so that if one side lost, another would remain a guarantee of their financial stability. And this balanced policy made them in many eyes the bankers of Europe itself. They did not belong to one country alone but to the financial system as a whole, yet their influence was not limited to high politics. Europe was moving through deep economic changes, from agriculture to industry and from local markets to global trade, and the Rothschilds were part of all of this. They invested in railway companies, mines, and shipping lines, funding projects that linked capitals and made the flow of goods faster and easier. And each new project was not just a financial deal, but another way to stretch their threads deeper into the continent. In the salons of Paris and Vienna, their story was told with admiration and a hint of mystery. It was said that they knew the movements of gold before kings did, and that their letters arrived before ambassadors. These were exaggerations, but not completely divorced from reality, for their network of messengers acted like a precise economic intelligence service, sending them news from every port and market. In the evening, when city noise faded, we can imagine their quiet offices, large rooms lit by oil lamps, desks piled with papers and telegrams, clerks checking ledgers and sending letters to other branches, and in the center of this calm there was always the sense that every number and every financial decision could change something in the fate of an entire continent. They had reached a level of influence no bankers before them had enjoyed, yet even then they remained cautious, for just as fortunes are built on trust, they can collapse with its loss. Thus they continued their work in silence, leaving kings in the foreground while they kept their place behind the curtain, turning the wheels without making a sound. By the middle of the 19th century, the family had reached the summit of its financial and political success. But behind the ornate doors and dazzling palaces, there was a daily life of strict order. Family members lived in homes designed with great care but free of needless extravagance. Their houses were not only symbols of wealth, but also places of work and meeting. In Paris, for example, James Rothschild's residence in St. Florentin combined French elegance with German discipline. With carefully arranged rooms, huge libraries filled with books on economics, history, and art, and separate wings for guests from noble families and thinkers who visited to exchange ideas or sign new agreements. In London, Nathan's home was different, simpler in appearance and stricter in routine. He rose early, reviewed market reports before sunrise, and sat in a lamp-lit study to examine the previous day's figures and plan the next. Though he had wealth enough for a life of unmatched luxury, his attachment to work was almost constant, and some said he knew no real rest except in his final moments. Yet the family's life was not without warmth and bonds. Each evening letters arrived from different capitals, carrying news of markets and small family stories. The birth of a child, a wedding celebration, or the illness of an elder in Frankfurt. These letters were more than the exchange of information. They were the glue that kept the family united despite distances. And in Vienna, Salomon made sure to attend musical evenings filling the city. Vienna then was the home of classical music, and the sound of orchestras echoed through theaters on long winter nights. And Salomon listened, not as a banker but as a lover of art, seeking balance for the noise of numbers. This gentle side of his life reflected the family's philosophy that wealth should be managed with the mind but lived with inner equilibrium. And in Naples, Karl followed a different pattern, one more connected to nature and daily warmth. His house overlooking the sea brought together European grandeur and Italian simplicity. And summer evenings on balconies facing the water, with warm breezes and the sound of waves, became an indispensable part of his routine, a time for quiet reflection that resembles the calm this story seeks to give the listener now. In Paris, the salons of James and his wife became known as meeting places for culture and thought. Poets, philosophers, painters, and politicians exchanged ideas there under candlelight and the scent of fresh coffee. These gatherings gave the family a dimension beyond money, a cultural presence that made the Rothschild name part of European intellectual life. And despite their wealth, the family maintained an inner discipline. They followed a simple rule, that wealth belonged to the family, not to individuals. And major decisions were not taken alone but after consultation between the different branches. This kept them united, able to face financial and political fluctuations without losing their balance. And over time, a new generation of Rothschild children grew up with this heritage. From a young age, they learned accounting, economics, and languages, but they also learned patience, politeness, and how to deal with kings and diplomats. And the family became like a school that produced business leaders who could remain perfectly calm even in the middle of crises. In one preserved family letter, a father wrote to his son that money is like water. It can irrigate the earth if guided well, but can drown it if left without dams. And perhaps this sentence captures their philosophy. Money was not an end but a tool, and quietness, rather than recklessness, was the secret of survival. And while Europe grew more restless with rising revolutions and wars, the family continued its peaceful life inside palaces and offices. They wrote, calculated, and planned as if running a small world of their own, where everything moved at a balanced rhythm, untouched by the noise outside. As the 19th century moved toward its later decades, it became clear that the Rothschilds were no longer just a banking network, but an unofficial international institution managed by a single mindset. At the same time, Europe was transforming at unprecedented speed. Railways traced iron veins between cities, factories filled the outskirts of London and Paris, and global trade expanded as new ports thrived. And in all these changes there was a financial fingerprint that could not be missed. It was the Rothschild mark, the family that funded lines connecting Paris and Berlin, supported mining ventures in distant mountains, and took part in founding shipping companies across the Mediterranean. And these projects were not only investments but ways to move the wheels of industrial Europe. With each contract, the network of influence grew more intricate, like a quiet web stretching its threads over capitals without being seen, and their reach extended beyond Europe. Their connections began to touch the Ottoman Empire, Egypt at the beginning of the Suez Canal project, and even British colonies in Asia, for they understood that money recognized no borders and that the future would not belong to Europe alone. Their accounts now contained currencies from many continents, and their financial papers were used in markets unknown to most Europeans, yet they preserved the same calm reserve. They did not appear as kings or politicians, they kept a studied distance. And while newspapers talked about their achievements and influence, they preferred silence, as if they understood that loudly proclaimed power weakens while power practiced quietly endures. Still, their influence was not free of challenges, for as nationalist movements grew in Europe, some voices began to question their role, asking how one family could control such amounts of money and whether it was merely a banking family or a sort of financial state across borders. These questions entered the European mind, and with them came many legends. Some newspapers printed greatly exaggerated claims about the size of their fortune, even saying they owned half the gold in the world. Such exaggerations fed the aura of mystery around them. But inside their palaces and offices, the family did not see themselves as kings, but as managers of a careful system who knew that one mistake could shake markets or erode trust. Their rule remained precision first, then calm, then continuous work, and in Paris, James reached the height of his status. His French bank became one of the strongest in Europe, funding government loans and managing wide investments in infrastructure. And in Vienna, Salomon received the noble title of Baron from the Emperor, formal recognition of his financial service. In London, Nathan's descendants dealt with the British government almost as if they were its own financial arm. And even in smaller Naples, Karl's branch kept its vital role as a bridge to the Mediterranean. The balance between the different branches was the family's secret strength. Each branch was independent in daily choices but part of a larger whole, like organs within one body. If one branch weakened, the others supported it. If one faced crisis, the rest gathered around it. And this unity allowed them to survive political and economic shifts that toppled older and less organized banking dynasties. Despite their success, the family did not ignore the slow passing of time. They saw transformations approaching, political changes, the growth of modern stock exchanges, and the rise of a new generation of industrialists whose fortunes came from factories rather than banks. The world was slowly changing its channel, like a river whose course widens, and the family watched this river from the shore, understanding that they had to adapt rather than resist. In quiet rooms of their palaces, they held regular family meetings, financial papers on the table, candles burning down slowly, and low voices exchanging views about the next step. These meetings were not loud or emotional, they were more like conversations among elders who knew that every decision, however small, could leave a deep mark. They had reached their peak, but they realized that every summit hides behind it the beginning of a slow descent. And this understanding was not fear but mature awareness that history moves in circles and that families, like empires, cannot remain at the same height of power forever. In the silence of those nights, as the last candles faded over the wide desks, Europe was preparing for a new phase, one that would test the family's ability to survive in a rapidly changing world. And by the end of the 19th century, the golden light surrounding the Rothschilds began to soften. It did not vanish suddenly, but dimmed gently like the warmth of a long day at sunset. While the Second Industrial Revolution reshaped the continent and redistributed economic power, huge factories became centers of new wealth, and inventors and industrial magnates, not bankers alone, became the heroes of the coming era. And the Rothschilds found themselves at a crossroads. They had built their glory on trade and government finance, on lending to kings and managing debts. But the kings themselves were losing their thrones, and peoples were demanding constitutions and elected governments. The economy was becoming faster and more complex, than in the age of letters sealed with wax. And the new world of modern stock markets, global trading, and giant industrial companies required a different style of management, less dependent on family relationships and more driven by institutions. In London, the British branch of the family felt these changes first. As the city grew at an astonishing pace and its financial market filled with new names, young businessmen from the middle classes entered banking with bold investments that did not follow the old traditions. Nathaniel Rothschild, leading the British branch at that time, understood that the age of quiet work and long correspondence was passing, and that the family would have to deal with a more transparent and less respectful world. In Paris, the situation was somewhat different. The French branch faced repeated unrest, from the fall of the Second Empire to the rise of the Third Republic, and each time the family tried to keep working and maintain political neutrality. But neutrality was not always possible in a land thick with revolutions and socialist ideas, where it was hard for a rich family to stay outside public debate, and newspapers grew bolder in their criticism. The public began speaking more openly about the power of money, and the name Rothschild, once pronounced in a respectful whisper, was sometimes mentioned with questioning or even suspicion, and although their wealth remained, the aura of absolute authority around them slowly eroded. In Vienna, the change was slower but more subtle. The Austro-Hungarian Empire itself was heading toward transformation, trying to keep pace with the new century, and the family that had gained noble titles began shrinking back into its own world. They focused more on estates and palaces than on markets, and meetings that had once crackled with energy became quieter, with newer faces less experienced and discussions more conservative, as the spirit of the founding generation faded with their passing. In Naples, where a branch of the family had played an important early role, the decline was clearer, as Italy unified under a single banner and the small kingdoms that had been important clients lost their significance. The old world that valued personal relationships and wax-sealed letters disappeared, replaced by a faster, more impersonal system. And by the end of the century, another wind blew from across the ocean. The United States, still young, was becoming a new center of wealth and financial power, and new banking dynasties arose there. Families such as Morgan and Rockefeller, with vast fortunes and remarkable organizational strength, while Europe was busy rearranging itself after smaller conflicts. America built huge financial institutions, redefining the idea of economic empire, and all of these changes reached the ears of the Rothschilds through weekly reports and long cables. With each piece of news, there was an unspoken feeling that their golden age was leaning toward its sunset. Yet they did not complain or fight the tide with violence. They faced it with a calm similar to that of elders who know that life's cycles do not repeat. They chose to watch, to preserve what remained of their achievements, and to reorganize their wealth inside modern institutions. They began investing in railway companies, metal industries, and philanthropic work bearing their name. And although they were no longer the central pivot of European politics, they remained a symbol of steady, quiet influence. In those years, one family member wrote to a cousin saying that their fathers had taught them how to gather wealth, and that their own generation must learn how to keep its dignity when that wealth fades. The sentence captured their condition at the start of the 20th century. The fortune still existed, but the old prestige had softened, and the new generation lived in a world that no longer knew the same relationships that had built the family's glory. The great cities were changing, cars replaced carriages, telephones began ringing in offices, and electric lights flooded palaces that had once glowed by candlelight. And with every new lamp, the past seemed further away and more peaceful. At the dawn of the 20th century, Europe appeared ready for a new age of prosperity, But beneath that calm surface, political tensions rose slowly, like the sea before a storm. The Rothschilds were not far from that scene, for their interests still extended across the main capitals from London to Vienna and from Paris to Frankfurt. Yet these capitals were heading toward a conflict no balance sheet could prevent. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the family found itself in a situation it had never known. For the first time, its branches stood on opposite sides of one great conflict. The British branch supported its country. The Austrian branch backed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the French branch stood with the Allies. And it was a war for which no financial neutrality was possible. The family chose silence and quiet work, staying away from public headlines and focusing on preserving their assets rather than shaping events. And their role shifted from funding governments to protecting what could be saved of old investments. Markets were capricious, currencies collapsed, and states imposed harsh controls on banks. And the world built by the first generation, a world of trust, formal letters, and stable deals, was collapsing under the new reality of total war. By the end of the war, the old Europe with which the family had dealt for a century had vanished. Empires disappeared. The Habsburg realm was gone. Russia entered a new era after revolution, and Germany emerged burdened with debt and penalties. All these changes struck at the core of the financial system in which the family had flourished. And in Vienna, some smaller branches closed, and the family lost a portion of its historic influence there. In France, their attempts to rebuild banking activity faced bureaucratic and political obstacles. And in London, the centre of gravity remained, but the city was no longer what it had been in Nathan's day. New banks, joint stock companies, and American investors began to fill the space and reshape the financial map of the world. And yet, the family did not disappear. They chose a more reserved and deeper role, focusing on long-term investments and on charitable and cultural activities. And in London and Paris, they founded institutions to support scientific research, art, and hospitals. They understood that times had changed and that direct financial power was no longer the only path to influence. And then came the Great Depression of the 1930s to add another layer of hardship. Markets crashed, banks lost trust, and business leaders everywhere suffered heavy losses. But the Rothschilds survived, thanks to their old caution. They had learned from long experience that money is not preserved by boldness alone, but by patience and prudence. And so their institutions remained standing, if less dazzling than in the previous century. Then came a darker decade, the Second World War, a conflict that threatened not just their fortune but their existence. In Europe, under Nazi occupation, the family's assets were targeted for seizure. Their old palaces were closed or taken, and in France the descendants of James were forced to flee, while in Austria banks and properties were confiscated. Those years were perhaps the harshest chapter of their story, a silent trial of what remained of their inner strength. And in London the British branch held firm. It worked quietly to protect what could be saved, and some members took part in supporting humanitarian efforts, helping refugees and funding relief campaigns after the war. And the family name was now mentioned, not only in the context of wealth, but also in the context of endurance in the midst of storms. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was exhausted. Like a city waking from a long nightmare, and among ruined cities and damaged banks, the family slowly began to catch its breath. They did not search for a return to past glory, but for a new meaning to their role in a transformed world, for the new era of American dollars, international institutions, and central banks no longer needed old banking families in the same way. With their usual rationality, they did not fight this reality. but shifted gradually from being lenders to kings, to advisors, to markets, from holders of hidden fortunes to managers of transparent investment institutions. The time when their family alone could shape Europe's finances had ended, and a new time had begun, a quieter and more thoughtful existence. Like a great wave withdrawing from the shore and leaving behind fine lines of water shining in the light of sunset. After the Second World War, Europe was nothing like the world their forefathers had known. Cities lay in ruins, economies stumbled, and the political map had been redrawn. And in this landscape, the family kept its habit of waiting before acting. In London, the British branch sat again in their offices that had survived the bombing by luck, walls still bearing the marks of time. Many files lost or burned, yet the most important things had not burned. Those survivors were their financial idea and their long relationships with generations of investors and institutions. And the family began to restore its role slowly, step by step. They did not seek control as in the past, but stability, creating modern investment funds, partnering with new banks, and embracing more advanced tools such as international bonds and stock markets. The world no longer ran on wax-sealed letters, but on numbers sent instantly by telegraph and later by telephone and radio. And with quiet experience, the family adjusted to the new rhythm without losing its calm identity. In Paris, the branch that had seen its properties seized under occupation returned to life, beginning a long process of rebuilding not only the bank but trust itself. And the new generation that had known the old glory only through letters was more modest and more committed to teamwork. They understood that the age of isolated, rich families had ended, and that survival required openness, transparency, and the spirit of the times. So they expanded their activities into new areas such as international financial consulting, energy investments, projects in Arab countries, and support for scientific research. Charitable foundations bearing the Rothschild name were established, funding hospitals, education, art, and the preservation of European Jewish heritage, and their goal was no longer only the accumulation of wealth, but the creation of meaning. In Vienna, which emerged from the war under occupation, the old branches had almost vanished, yet the family's legacy remained in street names and buildings, and in the collective memory that spoke of the Rothschild era like a royal chapter remembered with gratitude and nostalgia. In Britain, the English branch continued with measured steadiness, and in the 1950s and 60s, the family began to leave its mark on a new financial order built on cooperation rather than fierce competition between banks. They took part in economic conferences, helped found European development funds, and realized that modern influence came not through orders or private alliances, but through helping to build international institutions. During these decades, the family played a role in major debates about currencies, trade, debt, and growth, yet they preserved their old working style, quiet, precise, and behind the scenes, where a few carefully chosen words matter more than grand headlines. In the 1960s, a new generation appeared, educated in British and French universities, far from the old offices, and they were more open to modern ideas of economics, global trade, and emerging markets. One of them said in a rare interview that they were no longer guardians of gold, but guardians of the knowledge that makes money move. And that sentence captured the family's transformation. After building their power on gold and bonds, they now relied on thought, on a deep understanding of markets and history. And strength was no longer measured by the size of the fortune alone, but by the ability to read it, direct it, and use it for long-term paths. At the same time, they did not forget the human side that had marked their history. And in their later years in France and Britain, Rothschild institutions funded hospitals and medical centers, supported arts and libraries, and their name became as linked to culture as it was to finance. As the decades passed, history began to look at them with calmer and more just eyes, no longer seeing them solely as a symbol of mysterious power, but as a family that had been part of the making of modern Europe, both in finance and in culture. In this late calm, they found a kind of peace they had not known in the noisy days of their glory, while the cities that had once witnessed their rise, London, Paris, Vienna, went their own way, constantly changing and renewing. Yet, on some old stone plaques above the doors of former banks or palaces turned into museums, the family name remained carved. Those few letters standing as witnesses to 2 centuries of financial dreams and many lessons in rise and decline, ambition and restraint. They had passed through time like a long river whose course changed many times but never dried up, perhaps becoming calmer, narrower, or less visible, yet still flowing beneath the surface, feeding unseen roots. By the second half of the 20th century, Europe was slowly regaining its strength. Cities rebuilt themselves. Streets once filled with rubble were once again busy with life. But something in the continent's spirit had changed. Money had become less mysterious and more scientific, and power was measured more by institutions than by families. And in this new world, the Rothschilds did not vanish, but chose a bright, quiet shadow, a gentle place between presence and absence. They no longer appeared on front-page headlines, and people no longer spoke of them as they had in the 19th century. Yet they remained as a distant echo of a history that had helped shape modern Europe. In Britain, their banking group continued its work with a new spirit, managed according to modern corporate methods, with professional managers from outside the family and transparent policies aligned with the global economy, while the old name stayed on glass doors as a reminder that the past had not disappeared but settled quietly into the present. In France, the Paris branch kept funding large projects but shifted its focus, investing in clean energy, infrastructure, and cultural initiatives, part of a fresh vision that saw money not as a means of domination but as a tool for balance. They chose to be part of the global economy rather than try to direct it alone, like musicians playing in a long symphony rather than insisting on conducting it themselves. On the humanitarian side, their charities grew more than ever. The Rothschild Medical Foundation in London became one of the leading centres for health research, and the Edmund Rothschild Foundation in France became a major supporter of art, environment, and education. The name moved from banks to libraries, from palaces to universities, and from gold to knowledge. Yet the old mystery surrounding them remained part of their legend, and many people still linked their name to endless stories and theories. The reality, however, was simpler: an old family that once held the keys to money and then learned how to let go without losing its inner balance. Like a captain who hands over his ship to a new crew and then sits in silence, watching the horizon with a calm smile. By the end of the 20th century, as globalization grew, the family gained a presence in Asia and America as well, through institutions carrying their name, though the individuals had changed, and markets, technology, and money itself had changed. Electronic transfers, digital exchanges, and multinational corporations became symbols of an age their ancestors could never have imagined. And yet, had those ancestors lived to see it, they might have smiled at the development. It expressed the core idea they had believed from the start, that money is never fixed but a continuous motion, like a gentle current in a river that never stops. New generations learned from the Rothschild story that true survival does not lie in wealth alone, but in the idea that makes it useful, balanced, and renewed. And the family left behind not just bank accounts, but a long lesson in patience, organization, and thinking across time. On certain quiet nights in Paris, when someone passes an old mansion bearing their name, one can almost imagine the faint sounds of the past, papers being turned slowly, footsteps on wooden floors, and mixed languages speaking of the future. That past remains alive not in gold but in the mindset that helped build the modern world quietly. And in London, when you walk past the old office on St. Swithin Lane, the tall windows seem to watch the world in silence. Inside there are no kings and no great secrets, only neat desks and employees calmly working, a natural extension of 2 centuries of discipline. And the very air holds a trace of history but does not brag about it. After all these years, the name Rothschild has become a symbol of an idea deeper than money. The idea of quiet continuity in a changing world. And if you close your eyes now and imagine a long line stretching from narrow alleys in the old ghetto of Frankfurt to modern glass towers in London, you may feel that this story is not only about a family, but about time itself. It is about the human being learning to adapt and to withdraw gently when the moment for stopping has come. Now we reach the end of our journey with the Rothschild family, a journey that began in cramped alleys inside a poor Jewish quarter in Frankfurt, where a simple young man named Meyer Amschel collected old coins and wrote in small letters on rough paper. From their generations past, cities grew, and the world changed many times while the story walked at a measured pace, as if it knew that time was its closest friend. And when you look at their history from afar, you do not see just a tale of wealth. You see a complete picture of how a person can carve a place in the world and then keep it without getting lost in the noise of ambition. For they lived through an age when money was the language of power, and then watched the world turn into an era of institutions, technology, and knowledge. Yet, the core of the story remained the same, a balance between ambition and calm, between action and reflection, between strength and stillness. And perhaps that is why their name lingers even today, not as a symbol of pure glamour, but as a reminder of something deeper. History does not forget those who work with patience and who understand that true influence is not exercised with noise, but with trust, built slowly across generations. And if you contemplate their story now in this quiet night, you may feel that everything in it resembles the cycle of life itself. There is a small beginning, growing ambition, a long climb, then a peaceful maturity and a gentle withdrawal when the time arrives. Just as the sun rises, climbs, then leans toward the evening in a sunset that needs no announcement. Perhaps the lessons of faraway history echo in our lives more than we imagine. For each of us in some way passes through what that family passed through. We start from a simple point, seek stability, learn from stumbles, and finally reach a moment when we discover that calm is the most precious thing we can possess. Imagine the final scene now, night falling over a European city. A few windows glowing in old buildings that were once places of gold and bond trading. And inside there are no deals or meetings, only archives of old papers and a silence that resembles sleep. Those documents are no longer numbers, but markers of a long human journey that ended as all important things begin and end. In reassuring quiet, and perhaps the loveliest part of this story is the way it reminds us that wealth and power, no matter how great, are only temporary phases. What truly remains is the idea, the mark, and the way people walked through time. And when the pages of history close, there is nothing left but the gentle murmur of time flowing through the centuries, carrying the stories of those who lived with a balance between ambition and serenity. Let this story now settle in your mind like a distant melody that does not stir you but soothes you. The name Rothschild will stay somewhere in the background of awareness, like a faint light on the page of history that does not dazzle but never fully goes out. Breathe deeply now. Imagine yourself closing the book we have read together and placing it on a wooden shelf in an old library. Dust drifting slowly in lamplight as the room grows quieter and quieter until nothing remains but stillness. The story has ended, but the calm remains. And if you close your eyes, now let history stretch across your imagination like a long river of memories fading gently into a wide sea of deep sleep.